Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our new episode of Community Connection of the Lehigh Valley. I know it's been a while since we recorded something new, so we're excited to be back and to be able to offer some education and information to our community. I am Vicki Aloysia Casella, licensed professional counselor in Easton, and my co-host, Mark Kenny. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing well, Vicki. I miss doing these episodes with you, so I'm so glad that we were able to get back together for this one, and I'm very excited about this one. So glad to see you and glad to see that you're doing well.
Thank you. And I also missed working with you. Before we get started, just our usual disclaimer, if anyone who is listening to this right now is currently struggling from any mental health issues or concerns, we always, of course, encourage you to reach out to your medical doctor, therapist, crisis center, hospital, any local resources to kind of help you with symptoms that you might be experiencing. So our topic today, I think Mark and I believe are both feel that it's very important to revisit trauma and all the aspects that go along with that. I think most of us can agree that COVID and the pandemic has caused some level of trauma for all of us. And so just to continue to make people aware of resources that are out there and just kind of understanding all of it, even though I think we're hopefully coming to the end of it at this point, but just being aware that it doesn't necessarily mean that all the implications have ended from it. So welcome our guest. Nicole, if you would like to introduce yourself to our listeners and just say a little bit about who you are and what you do.
All right, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Dr. Nicole Monteiro. I am a licensed psychologist and I am a faculty member, a full-time faculty member at the Chestnut Hill College's master's program in clinical and counseling psychology. And I am at the main campus. So our program has two campuses, our main campus down in Philadelphia, and then our DeSales campus. So I'm primarily based at the main campus, and I am the advisor for the students who are in the trauma concentration. So I advise and help students to plan their course of study. I also teach trauma courses for the students who are in that track, as well as teach a diversity class that we have, and other supervision classes, in any way that we can support the students in supporting the community with its mental health needs. And I'm also a psychologist in private practice. My practice is called CHAD, the Center for Healing and Development, where I see primarily adults, who are dealing with various challenges, from anxiety and depression to just adjustments to things happening in life, things that we all go through. So
you must
Wonderful.
have an incredible
Welcome.
amount of energy.
Yes, I have my cat who's here next to me, who always comes in my office when I'm doing something. So that she's. Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can dive in by just explaining a little bit about what trauma is, how do you define it, how do we recognize it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I'm sure so many people are hearing a lot about trauma. And when I talk to my students or anyone else, I just say, let's make it real simple. Let's not get too caught up in technical definitions. Essentially, any experience or event that overwhelms your capacity or your ability to cope. So we all kind of know what stress is. Like, we can get stressed out and feel overwhelmed, but trauma is almost like a big blow to the system. So stress might be something that kind of eats at the system. And even though when it's chronic, it's unhealthy, but trauma is sort of like this kind of wrecking ball that comes in and sort of really disrupts how you are doing, how you are functioning or managing psychologically, emotionally, even physically. Psychological trauma can affect you physically. So it's this, anything that happens that like really disrupts or affects how you cope. And the other part that I always have students think about is that it has a lasting, or it can have a lasting impact. That's not to say that we can never overcome or be resilient or heal, but it just means that trauma isn't to be taken lightly, as if when something traumatic happens, the next day it's forgotten about. There are scars that it can leave even if we don't see them. So it's always it's always important to be mindful that it can have a lasting impact on just how we are in our day-to-day life and our relationships and how we feel about ourselves. And that's why it's so important for us to be aware of it and like, work on it.
Mhm.
That is the best description I've ever heard of trauma before. Thank you. I mean, to be able to just, because you're right that we make that definition so complex, but I think the way you broke it down, that's excellent. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you. I have 2 kids, and when I talk, the older one translates for the younger one. So I've learned from her, because she'll be like, translation, I'm going to say it in kid talk. So I started learning that skill from her.
That's great. That's great.
Nicole, can you give us, just from your observations, what are some of examples of possible traumas people may have experienced during a pandemic? Because I mean, not that trauma hasn't existed prior to them, but prior to this, but this is an historic event that is traumatizing in by itself. So, and can you just speak to what might be where you just talked about, where people sometimes ignore things like, oh, that's just, stress, that's not. So could you give us a couple examples from your experience and work to help us with that?
So the pandemic, and what are we going? We're like going into year 3 now, right? This is like it's something that I've never lived through. And so the traumas are on so many levels. Like, there are people who actually have had COVID and might have long haul COVID, or the after effects of COVID that disrupt their life. People may have experienced the loss of loved ones, like who have died from COVID, or somehow, themselves experienced long COVID or the after effects. People have lost things like jobs and financial, stability and well-being. People also, when we talk about like ambiguous loss or losses that are hard to describe, like we have lost a way of life. And in terms of socializing, in terms of not having to think about, the infections and masking, and we've lost in some ways connections with our community. There's a lot of divisions around like mandates and masking and different opinions and vaccines. And so that has created like, divides within communities. So there are a lot of these losses that are ongoing that people experience as traumatic. I know, like, from our perspective in our program, we were more than a year online, and the students were like, we lost our sense of connection to each other and to our professors and our school community. And that's something we can never get back. So those are the kind of things, like, we also know about traumas where it's interesting. There was a lot of research about how, like, with the virtual schooling at first, kids who were already at risk for being physically and otherwise abused were going to be at more risk because they were going to be at home and not be able to get out of that environment at any point. We've also seen, like, people have so many frustrations where we've seen like violent crime and murder rates go up. And a lot of I've been listening to it, and it's like people are correlating it with COVID, like when we all kind of were affected by the losses of COVID. So there's like so many ways that individually and even like just on a community level that it's affecting us in a traumatic way.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that even though that that it's like an overarching, and then we might be experiencing multiple traumas because of it.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so we in our lives.
Yes,
Mhm.
definitely.
Mhm.
I'd like to go back to when you said invisible scars. So
Mm.
I think that's the tricky part of trauma, because we can't always see someone else's trauma. So
Mhm.
how would you explain that? Like, the outside looking in, you don't see what happens in people's homes, right? You can't feel what another person is feeling. So how would you notice that trauma in another person?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because um we can't see it, but in some ways we can see it, but in ways that we don't always recognize, or aren't trained, or don't have knowledge to recognize. But one of the ways is you can notice that sometimes people's behavior changes, particularly within their relationships. So even this thing of an increase in violence, like when people are on edge, are irritable, are frustrated, are angry, are depressed, those feelings and those emotions tend to come out, especially if there's no healthy outlet for them um, within their relationships. So I always tell people, one sign that someone is struggling is if they become irritable, or you feel like they're short tempered or easily frustrated, or there were things that didn't tick them off before that really bother them, right? Or if you notice a person becoming more withdrawn, like their behavior changes, and that they like withdraw or they isolate, or if a person seems completely sort of overwhelmed in a way that they weren't before, and these are just some examples of like how a person's behavior might change. And even that person may not really understand or recognize what it's associated with, but it's that change in their inability to kind of cope with things that could be a clue.
And would that include things like difference in
Oh,
substance use, and noticing that type of thing, or other addictive behaviors that may start to show?
yes, that is actually a big one. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes. Anytime you have an increase in like trauma and stressors, people look for ways to numb the pain, essentially. So you will see an increase in those behaviors, substance use, other addictions, risk-taking behaviors. We're seeing a lot with teenagers, right, who are already in that stage where developmentally, but then it's almost like when you feel so restricted, the other extreme, you might go to the other extreme of like, it's just putting yourself in risky situations. But yes, the substance abuse is definitely a big sign. We're seeing a lot more people increase their drinking, increase mixing different substances. So they might be taking prescription medications and then mixing marijuana, or mixing in some cocaine or some alcohol, like people just really trying to figure out themselves how to numb their pain. Mhm.
Do you think there are
Thank you.
individuals? Yes, thank you. Do you think there are individuals who believe that they haven't been traumatized by what has happened?
Yes, I do.
And
I
how do
talk to,
you work through that?
yeah, I talk to people all the time. I was just actually in a conversation today when we were talking about, I said, I tried to normalize. I said, everybody in some way has been touched by trauma, either directly or indirectly. And I said, a lot of times we think about it as these big things, like you were severely abused physically, or you witnessed some horrible event, which that does happen to a lot of people. And then that makes the people who haven't experienced those big T events, as we call them, feel like they aren't, it almost is like they minimize their own trauma. So they end up saying, no, I had a perfect life, or I grew up completely happy, or things don't affect me, it doesn't bother me. Or there are people who are I'm so blessed. There are people who are much less fortunate than me. But what that does is that has us to diminish the ways that, for example, COVID or any other event that could be traumatic, we minimize the impact on us. So when people say that, I literally, normalize it. Like I say, we all, so not you, but like we all are affected in some way by trauma in our lives.
I'm wondering if those individuals perhaps find it too scary to acknowledge that they've experienced trauma, because then maybe they don't know how to handle that or cope with that if they bring light to that situation.
Yes. I remember, I don't know if you have seen the TED Talk by Nadine Burke, she did the whole TED Talk on the adverse childhood experiences. And she talked about how, like, she was just so amazed by this research that showed the connection between childhood trauma and later health, problems. And she was like, I thought everybody would be excited. And then I realized they weren't. And she said, at first, I thought it was because people thought, oh, it's just those people over there. And she said, but eventually I realized that we didn't want to face it because we all are affected by trauma and it's too painful. So I thought that was so profound, because it's almost like what you said, if people, we use denial. We don't want to face it because it's too painful, or we're afraid, like, okay, if I say I'm traumatized, then what? Like, where am I going to get help? Or what is that? People always tell me, like, what good is that going to do?
And the thought that comes to that for me is shame. Shame is one of those really intense emotions. Like, then do I have to feel shame because I acknowledge that there's trauma in my life? Like, I think it's just layers upon layers. I don't know. Can you share anything on shame? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because shame is one of the key sort of emotions or experiences that people who've experienced trauma feel. And shame is that there's something wrong with me, versus guilt, which is, oh, I feel bad, I regret that I did that. It's about an action, where shame is almost attributing negative things to oneself. And that is, people don't say it. People don't come out and say, hey, I feel shame, right? It's something that you kind of read between the lines as far as them hiding or how they feel, or not wanting to really face those experiences because they feel that it means almost like you're defective. So that is one of the key things. And I think it takes so much compassion and helping a person to feel safe enough to face those feelings, because we don't, I think I saw you even wrote about vulnerability. Like, we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable because it's scary and we don't know if it's safe to do so. And especially with a feeling like shame, who wants to admit that? It's really scary.
And what I've noticed in our society or in our community is, if someone speaks up about something like abuse and the individuals hearing this don't want to accept it, you could potentially be met with things like defensiveness, dismissiveness, criticism, ignorance, so on and so forth. And the conversation that I was having this past week with my own therapist was, those aspects do not foster an environment where we can feel safe to share. It doesn't foster healing. If you take all the strength you have to speak up about something that has happened to you, trauma, and you were met with fighting, how is that supposed to help anyone heal? But then that's like, it's multiple layers of multiple people and multiple personalities. And how does someone navigate that?
Yeah, exactly. Which is why, like, a safe place like therapy is so helpful and vital for all of us, because I think, yeah, you get met with, and also not only defensiveness, criticism, but like full on attacks when
Yes,
people come out.
absolutely.
Yeah, like it's almost like your character and everything about you is attacked, which becomes another trauma besides the initial one that you were sharing about.
Mhm. So why not choose, like, why do you think people respond in this emotion-driven way as opposed to let me pause and try to understand and try to show empathy and try to show compassion? Like, what distinguishes the difference between people choosing to attack as opposed to
Mhm.
people choosing to offer compassion?
Yeah, I think first of all, fear-based reactions can be more automatic. Those are also trauma reactions.
Mhm.
So it's this cycle where we may have trauma that we don't acknowledge. We get triggered by someone else sharing theirs. We have this fear-based, automatic shutdown response. And then it doesn't help that in our society, I think, in my opinion, especially now, fear is a powerful emotion. And I think it's been exploited by a lot of people in power to where they want people to go off of fear and to not, like, no one's having conversations about let's pause, like you just said, let's reflect, let's not be reactive. It's almost like we're being encouraged through so many different ways, and directly and indirectly. Even to me, the 24-hour news cycle is like breaking news. Like everything is like eliciting these fear responses. So we're on this high alert. And I think that's almost like so primal that we react like that.
Thank you for all of your validation. Mark, I'm monopolizing the conversation. I apologize. What are your questions?
You're asking excellent questions. I mean, I think one of the things as I hear this conversation is, Nicole, what are your thoughts about, we keep talking about this ending, that this is going to transition into an endemic. But from a mental health perspective, it isn't like the brain stops just because the virus has stopped.
Yeah.
What is it that we will need to know going forward into this decade in terms of as we said before, there's been trauma before COVID. We see the disparities and inequalities in our society. So people haven't necessarily experienced this in the same way. Maybe we've been in the same ocean, but we've been in different boats with this experience. And so it isn't just going to be all calm and blue sky when the medical world says, oh, now it's just an endemic. It's no different than the flu or a cold. What are your thoughts about how this trauma is going to carry on beyond the ending of this medical situation?
Yeah. I think it goes back to sort of the unseen effects and the lasting impact trauma can have. So I think we should all, hopefully, as a society, educate ourselves on the importance of mental health and the way mental health challenges can affect the rest of your life and how you function. And I think there's still going to be a lot of uncertainty. We have a pandemic, we have conflict in the world that is affecting people financially, domestically. So there's so much uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers anxiety and fear and all that cycle we talked about. So I think the more we talk about it and educate ourselves, and us as mental health professionals, educate people, it helps to normalize that this thing is not going to just end like this. Just because you're taking down a mask doesn't mean you're taking off all of the ways that it affected you. I think we are going to, like, I heard a report that was talking about with young people, how this is really going to have some lingering effects, because this is during key parts of their development and their brain developing and socially. So we have to be mindful of, like, children and then soon to be young adults, and how it's going to affect their view of things. We might see more anxiety, we might see more depression, or Mark, we might see more substance use. And we have to be prepared to connect the dots and really help people. And again, to not feel ashamed if I always tell people, you might be coping in a quote unhealthy way, but you are doing the best that you know how. Now let's try to help you learn other ways, but not to shame people for not knowing how to cope with a global pandemic that we've never, the last one that I remember was in 1918, not I remember, but my grandfather, he was still traumatized that his mom died during that. And whenever he would see, he would tell the story. He was like, never let your kids don't have a coat on. And so like those things stick with people.
Yeah.
They really stick with people.
That was one of my questions. You just gave a great example. My other question was about if we don't heal, then we pass that trauma on generationally. Just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean it disappears. Can you talk about that concept of, intergenerational transmission of trauma?
Yeah, I think you just described it so well. Like it's almost its own contagion because, but the antidote is to talk about it. But so many people, especially when groups of people have trauma, they want to move on, they want to be resilient, and they feel like, oh, I don't want to burden the kids and everything, or I don't want to talk about it. But that actually makes it continue because we never really get a chance to fully process it. Or, for example, kids who grow up with parents who have a lot of trauma, even though the parents don't talk about it, it affects the kids as far as anxiety, as far as the kids feeling the energy and knowing something isn't right, or their mom or dad is depressed. Like they absorb all of that. So I think you described it well. If we don't talk about it, it continues.
So how do we take the baby steps of starting to heal, right? Because, okay, so there's trauma everywhere. Now, what do we do with it? Like once we acknowledge, right? Because awareness is key, right? So once we acknowledge that there's some level of trauma, now what? Now what do we do?
Yeah. Well, I think things like your program are so helpful because I always think about mental health as like from a public health perspective. So there's like universal things that like are for everybody. So educating people, normalizing and explaining certain things about mental health are key. And then making sure that we on a like group level help to teach people how to access things like therapy, or how to learn about how stress relief techniques like mindfulness or exercise, or spending time with people, like making the connection that those are part of improving your mental health. I think initially in the pandemic, Calm, the app was like, they gave it out free for a few months or something like that. So everybody could use that. And just continuing to have conversations and normalize good self-care. I have on LinkedIn, I started a newsletter called The Healing Space. And one of the things I like to talk about a lot in there is like dealing with burnout, how to have healthy routines in our daily life, how to help our perspective so we focus on what we can control versus being obsessed with what we can't control. So like those kind of techniques that will help all of us. It's almost like, what was it that my mom was telling me when they started putting vitamins in the bread? What was it? Iodine. There's something, a mineral that every child needed, and they were deficient. So they decided to put that mineral in all of like the breads and rices and things like that. Instead of like, so everyone got it. And I feel like that about mental health. Like we need to make it something like we teach and talk about these things so everyone has access, versus like, oh, you only have to go to therapy. That's the only way you're going to learn that.
I feel like our society is slowly starting to learn, like as I believe all schools are becoming trauma informed now,
Okay.
and that at least in my area, they're becoming trauma informed, that there are not only guidance counselors, but there are also therapists coming into the schools to offer more therapy, and it seems like they are starting to recognize, the impact on children specifically, the environments they grow up in, or just the education that adults need in order for helping the children around them and just a community in general. Still a lot more that I think that needs to be done for our community, but I think we're slowly getting there.
Yes. I work sometimes with like older clients who are like in their 70s, and just who for their first time have come to therapy, and just like hearing them say like, we never got to talk about this. Like we would get bullied and we would just suck it up. Like we never, and they would just say like how they feel so free being able to talk about things that they couldn't during their time.
Yeah.
Are there resources that you would recommend? Like, okay, so therapy can be scary, right? Speaking up can feel really anxiety provoking. So if someone's not ready to approach that avenue yet, what could be some potential other resources that they can look into?
So I think there's a lot now on the internet, like even NAMI, a National Association for the Mentally Ill, has a lot of great psychoeducational videos about different mental health experiences that people may have. I love the apps like Calm and Headspace, because not only are they like doing meditation and things, but they have many courses where they teach about things like anxiety, and like they just give information about how to cope in your day-to-day life. I think there's a lot on YouTube, some not so good, but like there are some great channels from like places, for example, the Center for the Treatment of Stress and Anxiety, which is associated with the University of Pennsylvania, but like they just have a lot of free resources on their website. I believe they have a YouTube channel, just helping to educate. I think one of the key things is help to, as you said, validate and normalize, so people don't feel like they're the only ones. Like we are all in some ways going through some kind of anxiety, stress, overwhelm. Like, so whoever is thinking they're alone, you're not alone. So those are a few of the resources.
Thank you.
And would you think of any community organizations or institutions that are familiar to people that maybe that would be a safer place for them to start a conversation with someone?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think a lot of more and more people's faith communities are acknowledging the importance of mental health and having conversations around that. I've even seen at many free libraries different like resources and sometimes talks around mental health topics. Local universities, so you all are, we're here in Philadelphia, but like we have a clinic with that is associated with our program, Chestnut Hill College, and it's for the community. And the same out in the Lehigh Valley, right? Like whenever you have a college or university, there are usually some resources that are connected to the community. And even now people's workplaces, most workplaces have the EAP, or like employee assistance program, where you could literally just talk to somebody for like 3 or 4 sessions. Not this, you're not committing for life, you're talking to somebody to just start to experience the process.
Great, thanks, Nicole, for those great ideas.
Yeah.
Are there any other thoughts that you have, Nicole? Like anything profound that you feel like we've kind of haven't asked about, or that you would like to share with our community?
I don't know if it's profound, but I would just say that, I always tell my students, trauma has existed since humans have existed. And resilience is part of our makeup. You know, we haven't gotten this far, like as far as surviving as a species without having not only physical resilience, but also mental resilience. So that's also part of our story, that we can, especially collectively. I always love reading about like collectivist cultures where as a community, people do things like sing songs that express tragedy or trauma, or work together to rebuild their community. Like these are ways of coming together that help to promote resilience. And I think we have to really think about that again, like in this day and age, as far as like what we do collectively to promote healing and promote acceptance of each other, regardless of our differences, and promote talking about painful things, knowing that that helps get us to the other side.
That's beautiful. And the thing that comes to my mind, and maybe this is going back to the fear-based trauma that you were talking about, is I feel like I see a lot of like a them versus us. You know, it's like the people who have been abused and then us, the people who are addicts and then us, right? But what if we took a moment to see ourselves in them and vice versa, to realize that maybe we are more connected to each other than we think? And what if we were, like, what would that mean for us to be able to see each other and hear each other and value each other as just as humanity? Like, you know, but not that divide, but that unity of like, if we could just acknowledge each other, that maybe healing wouldn't be so difficult.
Yeah, I think that would be like, that would take us at least 50% of the way, right?
I would think, but how beautiful would that
Or
be? Yeah.
Just to be validated in that way, I think would relieve so much of even the shame that you described earlier.
Yeah.
Because people would say, wow, there's nothing wrong with me. This was just a horrible thing that happened. It's not nothing wrong with me.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm just taking deep breaths over here. Anything else, Mark? Anything else you want to share? Thoughts that are coming to mind?
My only thought coming to mind is I think we need to invite Dr. Monteiro for another show, because I feel another show is coming on here at the end. So that's all I have to say.
Part two, absolutely.
I'm feeling at the end. So I'm feeling a sense of joy at this moment. And the conversation that we had today. So I'll hand it back to you, Vicki.
Yeah, I love that you said that you feel joy, because I think that's the thing that we fail to understand, that if we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable and to work through that pain together, that there is something beautiful on the other side. I think, Nicole, you already alluded to something like that, you know, that if we can do it collectively together, and help each other out, that there is something beautiful on the other end of that pain and that trauma that we experience. So thank you, Nicole, your words of wisdom, your education, your information. I love it all. Thank you for all that you do. And I am absolutely on Mark's side with the part 2 coming up. So to our listeners, stay tuned for that. I guess one last question, Nicole, is there any contact information that you would like to share with our listeners today?
So you can go to my website, which is www.chadwellness.com. So CHAD wellness.com. And my number for my office is 215-874-4225. And if you go to the website and you have a question, you can contact me through the website.
Okay, wonderful. You have been an amazing guest. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mark, as always, for being a wonderful co-host. And to our listeners, please stay tuned for part 2. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Okay, take care.
Thank you, Nicole.
Okay, thank you.